Hello all, and welcome. Hello, Maudlyne. This is the first episode of Media Curious, which talks to media folks in the Chicago area about their jobs, and so we can learn more about them and learn more about what backstage at in the newsrooms. So my friend Maudlyne, she is an award-winning columnist for the Sun-Times. She pens the papers, Chicago Chronicles, which is long-form columns about what makes the city tick. She recently published her family memoir about her family surviving the Nigerian-Biafran War and how they came to the U.S. in a book called Escape from Nigeria, a Memoir of Faith, Love, and War. So thank you, Maudlyne, for being my first guest for Media.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I like your hair today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So you went into journalism. What were you thinking?
I know, right?
Yeah, this was a long time ago, so it's not like asking a millennial what they're thinking.
Right, that's true.
But back in the day, this was in the mid 80s when you decided to go into journalism. And right from grad school, you went right to the Sun-Times. So what was that all like? And what inspired you to get into journalism? And when did you make that decision?
Well, I was a kid who loved to read. And my dad was this kind of father who would pile us all up in the station wagon every Saturday, whether it was winter or summer, and drive us to the local library. And we would be held hostage there for 2 hours, where we would be instructed to read a bunch of books and then choose 3 or 4 and check them out. And at the end of that next week, we'd have to give them a full report on the books that we read. And we were back in the station wagon, headed back to the library. So, at first we used to complain all the time. In the summer, you want to be outside, you see all your friends playing, and you're walking to the station wagon going, and then after some time, my dad, who used to come downstairs and say, get up, we're going. Now we were the ones banging on his door saying, Dad, when are we going already? So that's how he instilled a love of reading in us. And that's where my love of reading came from. And from there, I was the kid who my dad would have to come to the bedroom door after it was lights out. And he'd send us all to bed. He'd come back about, 10 minutes after he turned off the lights. And he'd open the door and without looking in say, Maudlyne, turn off the flashlight, because he knew I had picked back up the book and was reading. So my dad announced to me about the time I was, 6 or something like that. Maybe one day you'll write books that other people will want to read. And that was it. It was done. I was going to be a writer. And so, from very early, I knew I wanted to write, not necessarily journalism. Journalism came in college. I wasn't that teenager who wrote for the school paper and always knew they wanted to be a reporter. It was in college when I went to the University of Iowa for their world famous writers workshop, because I wanted to write books. And it was after the first year, maybe the second year, I realized, wait a minute, you mean you can't make a living writing books? Who's gonna pay the rent? What do you mean? I thought, so it was like, what do you do now, And it was a natural. I walked across the hall, the proverbial across the hall, to the journalism department. And, my first few classes, I fell in love.
Cool. But then you went on to grad school too at Northwestern.
Yeah. After Iowa, I was graduating and I was thinking, how do I set myself apart? Because it was back then, it was a very competitive field. And most of us were, told that you were going to have to start your career in quote unquote Podunk, Iowa. And that's the way that they described some small town in Anywhereville. And so, and work your way back up to a major metropolitan area. And I wasn't quite, looking forward to that. And I was also I also came from a very close-knit family, and most of my family were in the Chicago area, although I was raised in the southwest suburbs. And so I just, was thinking, and I was like, well, you know what? I'll go to grad school and put an MA behind my name, and that will give me a leg up, so that if they're looking at my resume and they're looking at the resume of someone who's comparable, but one's got a BA and one's got an MA, maybe that'll give me a leg up. And quite frankly, it was the best decision I ever made, because I, of course, chose the #1 journalism school in the country at that time, probably still is, Medill at Northwestern University. And so, yeah, so while I was there, I applied for an internship at the Chicago Sun-Times. And it was through Medill that I got that internship. And at the end, I worked my butt off, and I was just determined that they would remember me by the time I left. And so that when I came knocking on the door, perhaps they would think kindly if they had anything open at all. And that's what happened. I finished that internship that summer, went back and finished grad school, came back like 6 months later begging for a job. They told me there was nothing available, and I kept begging and kept begging and kept begging until they got tired enough of me begging and offered me a position.
Fantastic. Lucky them.
Thank you.
You've had a variety of roles. You haven't always been writing a column.
No. I started out like every other reporter, GA, general assignment. And I did that for a few years, then you graduate up. And so I think I first started from general assignment, then I covered crime, then I covered education, and then I covered housing. And that was during the years when public housing was a huge issue. And I really cut my teeth on that beat in terms of, finally getting on the radar nationally of stories. And from there, I was covering urban affairs, expanded the housing beat to housing and urban affairs. And after that, a few years of that, my boss created a new beat because the federal government was was changing the welfare system, which I had covered extensively from a housing perspective. And the new rules called for, a lot of people were being kicked off the welfare rolls. And what it meant is that someone was going to have to, fill in the gap. And we suspected, or at least my boss suspected, Nigel Wade at the time, that social service agencies were going to be inundated. And that was a sector that we needed to get in front of and begin to look at. And he was very, very forward thinking, because sure enough, the social service sector rose in prominence. It was where all the issues came to roost. And so I covered that for some time. And then I covered DCFS for some time. And I left the Sun-Times after covering DCFS for some time. And I'd gotten, on the radar of the director there. And so I got this call one day offering me a job to come to the other side. And I got the call several times and ignored it. But then finally, as with everything, the timing and the numbers were right.
So they kept begging and begging until you finally succumbed. So very good. So what was that like, being on the other side, not being, not having the byline anymore, but instead you were a press secretary for DCFS?
Yeah. It was completely an adjustment. I mean, public relations and journalism, you figure if you can do one, you can do the other, but you forget what you were like as a journalist.
Yeah.
A PR person couldn't convince you of anything, And so to find myself thinking, that because I had right on my side and in terms of honesty, you know, I wanted to be honest, which was something that the DCFS had an issue with, in terms of honesty and openness about the child abuse cases that kept turning up in the news. And so, you know, I came in with the mandate that we were going to be open and honest, and of course that was going to get us better treatment. I forgot who I was dealing with. I was dealing with me. So it was a challenge. It was a challenge, and it was an adjustment. You know, and also it was a challenge to work in an arena where you can't open your mouth without thinking how it's going to affect the person that's like way, way up there. You know, you're far away from the governor, but you can't say anything without considering how it's going to affect the governor and run it through all these different layers. So government was interesting. It was interesting. And you get to that place where you're like, wow, you know, you know, I don't like this whole fettered thing, you know. As a journalist, you just kind of run with it, and suddenly you're in this arena where you run with nothing. You know, you walk unless you're told to run, you know. So it was interesting, and I left there 2 years later, after Governor Edgar retired, and I went to start my own business. I hung my shingles and started my own PR firm.
So we were talking about the hierarchy of government when you worked with government, and there were so many layers. And
right.
So what's it like at the newsroom? How many layers of hierarchy are there? How is it that you get stories pushed through?
Well, it's a lot different in a newsroom than it is when you're working for the governor. You know, it's the hierarchy is there's an editor-in-chief, but you have a direct editor. And, you know, certainly when you're a rookie, you know, you're assigned, you're told what to write about. But when you're a veteran, you come up with your own stories and you write about what you want to write about, and you run it by your editor. And if your editor, you know, thinks it needs some feedback or some changing or whatever, she'll give you that feedback. You know, but you're pretty much, you don't have to worry about how your work is going to affect someone that's 10 layers at the top, you know?
Cool. So the Chicago Chronicles, I have a couple questions regarding that. What is it that you're trying to do with that column?
Well, you know, the column was the brainchild of my former editor-in-chief, Jim Kirk, who is now editor-in-chief of Kring Chicago Business. And communities of color have long complained that news outlets only portray people of color when it is in a negative way or when there's crime. And so this is a complaint that predates me. It's always been there. And so, you know, my editor, you know, kudos to him. He said, we've got to figure out how to address this. And he came up with the idea, you know, for Chicago Chronicles, which would, you know, find those stories that these communities say we never write about, you know, and portray, you know, the positive stories. And, you know, basically that would inspire us all. So, you know, so my job is to tell those stories of both extraordinary and ordinary people. So I might write about, I don't know, I might write about a celebrity, you know, and interview them on, you know, how they got where they are to inspire the next generation. Or I might write about, you know, the woman on the corner in Inglewood with her lawn chair, you know, to drive off the gangs off her corner, who people thought were crazy at first, and suddenly the gangs left, and the whole neighborhood comes out now and joins her on the corner barbecuing, and it's a whole movement, you know. So I'll write about extraordinary and ordinary people, and they're all positive stories that you never hear about on a regular basis.
What are some of the people that stick out in your mind, especially? I mean, you mentioned the woman in Inglewood, Tamar.
Right.
I happen to know her.
Yeah.
But who else have you felt like absolutely privileged as a journalist to have had the chance to meet?
Well, gosh, you know, I have felt that way about many ordinary people because their stories have moved me so much. I am more impressed by the ordinary people's journeys. you know, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm more impressed by that. But in terms of the celebrities or well-known folks, you know, that I was, that I felt honored to meet and interview are some of my heroes as an African-American female writer. You know, there's Toni Morrison, for example, and who passed away last year. And when she was here in 2010, I got to interview her in her hotel room. And a lot of our interview didn't get into the story, you know, because I asked her for advice as a African-American female writer. And, you know, she shared with me a few nuggets that, you know, that I will treasure forever, such as, you know, be true to yourself. And, you know, you remember that you represent not just yourself, but a people. What else? And, oh, and no matter what, you know, remember that you have to be honest, you know, be honest, and that when you get where you're going, you have to reach back and pull someone else up with you. So those were the kind of nuggets that I just, you know, I treasured, and they weren't for any column, you know. And in fact, that was a funny story. It was also a great lesson in that some experiences aren't meant to be shared, because, you know, I asked Toni Morrison to take a photo with her, you know, and she said, absolutely not. You know, she said, not if it's for social media. She said, now if it's for just you, okay. And I was like, okay, of course it's just for me, knowing full well I had intended to put it on social media, you know. But I left with that photo, and I treasured that photo and that experience and the words she gave me. And it taught me a lot about some moments are meant to be private. And I never shared that photo until after she died.
Very good.
So, you know, there's her, there's Maya Angelou, as in terms of those folks who are heroes. Some of my favorite actresses, like Viola Davis, Angela Bassett, Spike Lee. You know, there's athletes like Walter Payton, you know, the late Walter Payton, Michael Jordan, you know. So yeah, just some of those.
So who's on your bucket list? Who do you want to talk to before you retire?
Oh my gosh. There's a few people on that list. At the top of the list is Oprah, you know, who I'd met when I was at DCFS. And she had granted one of our foster youth, and a prom experience. And so it was my responsibility to chaperone the girl and bring her to the show and take a picture with Oprah, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I wasn't thinking about Oprah as, you know, oh my God, the great talk show queen. I was just like, okay, this is the job. Get the girl to the show, get her back safely. And, you know, to this day, I can't believe I didn't try to talk to Oprah, you know, or save the photo. I have no idea what happened to the photo. So there's that. And then there's Obama, President Obama. You know, someone who I had met many times before he became president and interviewed while he was senator. And, you know, and of course I ran the campaign of Congressman Bobby Rush when President Obama was seeking to unseat him. And it was the only race that President Obama lost on the upward trajectory to the presidency. So I was press secretary for that campaign. And, but I also had a side business managing events, doing events management. And I did that for many African groups in the city. And so several of them, once or twice, we had Obama as our keynote speaker while he was senator. So I have photos with him, you know, but again, never thought about this man was going to be president. Who knew, right? So I'd love to sit down with him now that he is president and talk about race and America, you know, one-on-one. So there are people like that. There are favorite actresses like Kerry Washington. I'd love to meet her. She's married to my brother. I say my brother because he's a Nigerian athlete who I have interviewed her husband, but I never interviewed her. So, you know, there's a lot of people.
Cool. You were talking about reaching back, that Toni Morrison reminds you to remember to reach back. And I think that's what a lot of your National Association for Black Journalists is about.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's all about mentoring the next generation. That's the only reason I do it. It's a lot of work. Just like I'm president of both the National Association of Black Journalists Chicago chapter, as well as the Chicago Journalists Association. And both of my positions are about, you know, mentoring and assisting. At NABJ, you know, it was my first love, and I you know, was chair of their scholarship committee for years, about 6 years or so, before I became vice president of print and began to focus on their mentoring programs, and eventually, you know, became president for, I'm in my, well into my third year now, 2.5 or so as president. But, you know, for me, it's all about helping the next generation of journalists coming behind me, because, you know, this is an interesting time in our history. It's not like it was when I was coming in. You know, the industry has constricted and downsized, and so, you know, youth need to know that there's still a place for them in this industry. And these days, it's not about what you know, it's who you know, although that's probably always been true. And so, you know, I very much am committed to making sure that those coming behind have the sort of networking and resources that are available to those who are probably more established and more come from wealthier backgrounds. You know, a lot of the people who enter the business, young people of color, you know, they come for a reason, because they want to give voice to their people. And it's the same reason that, you know, that is deep down in my heart today. Mine is give a voice to all disadvantaged, all people. And so it's the same thing at the Chicago Journalists Association. You know, I might add that because of the you know, constriction of the industry, you know, there's so many journalists today who are out of work, unemployed, underemployed, you know, who have been downsized and looking to reinvent themselves or looking for resources and connections. And so it's not just the younger generation that I seek to help. You know, I want to be there for journalists, period, those of my peers who might need assistance and resources and connections and networking and programming. So yeah, that's why I do it. It's a lot of work. It's not just to be doing it. It's about giving back.
Fantastic. And let me, on behalf of everybody who has benefited from your work, let me say thank you.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. It's been just about 3 years since you were able to publish your family's memoir. Tell us more about that.
Oh gosh, that was a journey. That was May of 2016, and you know, my book, Escape from Nigeria, a Memoir of Faith, Love, and War, is my mother's story. It's her memoir. And my mother is the most amazing woman that I know. You know, she's one of the strongest women that I know. This is a woman who survived a war with 6 small kids in tow, and war is hell. You know, anything you can imagine that is the unimaginable that happens in war, it happened. And she, you know, survived and protected 6 small kids, you know, and for 2.5 years, neither my mom nor my dad knew if the other was alive, because my dad was here in the States when the war, you know, had broken out. And so, you know, my mother did everything to protect us in a war where 2 million of my tribe, the Igbos, died of starvation and massacre. And you know, it's a genocide that was the 5th worst genocide of the century. And so for my mom to be able to survive that, she was a woman of incredible strength and resource and faith. And it was because of her faith that she was able to get an offer from a nun to smuggle a letter out of the country halfway around the world to reach my dad, who was here at Northwestern University at the Kellogg School of Business. And so, for his part, my dad had hung on as well to the belief and faith that his wife and kids were alive, as so many people told him, "Are you crazy? Have you seen the footage of the starving women and children, the bodies? Maybe it's time for you to gain some acceptance that your family is dead. We'll help you." And he was like, "No, thank you. I don't want your help to gain acceptance. You don't know my wife. My wife is one of the strongest women in the world." And it was his faith that had him hanging on too. And so when the letter arrived, it was that kind of faith between two people that led his mentor and instructor at Kellogg, along with his wife and 3 other couples on the North Shore of Chicago, to band together in the most heroic of feats to first find my family in the midst of a raging war and then bring us out. On June 9, 1969, we landed at O'Hare as refugees of the Nigerian-Biafran War with the clothes on our backs. And it is only by the grace of God and through the strength of the woman I call my mom that I sit here talking to you today.
If somebody wants to buy the book, can they get it?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon, absolutely. Escape from Nigeria, a Memoir of Faith, Love, and War. And if you want a signed copy, you can always email me. And I am reachable at the Sun-Times at Ihejirika at suntimes.com. M. Ihejirika, that's my first initial and last name, at suntimes.com.
And that's where people can reach you if they have column ideas for you.
Oh, absolutely. Please.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for talking to me.
Oh, this has been a pleasure. Thank you, Karen.
All right. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.